Hi, everybody. Thank you for having all of us. It is a privilege for me to be here with the secretary, though he told me that I have to call him Tim, so I'm going to try to do that, and here with Patrick. We're going to have a conversation.
Well, as you can hear, I think really, given those introductions and associated resumes, I think the privilege here is in fact mine. They had to really reach to find some things.
Not true. We have a college dropout and someone who didn't drop out.
That's a generous way of putting it.
We want to talk about the economy. We want to talk about business. We want to talk about where we are today and perhaps and hopefully where we are going in the future amidst all of these questions about policy, both here in the United States and around the world, and also to talk about business and startups and the startup economy and what it takes to make it work and whether it can work amidst all of these questions about policies that seem to be changing. So let me start, though, with you, Mr. Secretary Tim. Where are we? When you think about the economy today, relative to whatever we hear about the stock market, what do you think is going on in the real economy today?
I kind of feel like all the things that matter today in the economy are not really about the economy and about economic policy. They're about politics. And you know, we're a pretty lucky country, still a pretty innovative, resilient country, even with all our challenges and all the dark, sad, tragic stuff about our economy. Pretty lucky in our challenges still compared to most countries. But you know, the deep existential things we face are whether we can rediscover some capacity to get out of this political system, you know, a set of policies that are good for incentives, good for innovation, you know, better public goods, to deal with things only the market can't do, only governments can do. And I feel like that's, you know, people say, you know, what should we worry about? What are the risks? All the risks are in that area.
So that's, can I answer?
Please, you can, absolutely.
So without making necessarily absolute statements, because, you know, perhaps that's difficult, but on a relative basis, how much more or less optimistic are you than you were, you know, towards the end of last year?
Oh, I think I'd be much more worried today. You know, we're, you know, the world, in some ways, the world is, you know, it's healing from the crisis. Some ways it looks a little more stable than it has. You're seeing a little bit more growth outside the U.S. Some of the acute fears of, you know, collapse of EMU and
right.
Those things seem receding a little bit. Some of the worst fears of the populist fever are receding. So a lot of people look at the world and say, gee, the worst stuff hasn't happened yet.
VIX is at an all-time low.
Maybe it's, yeah, maybe it's going to be fine. But I think you have to look through that, and you still have a set of underlying forces in the economy which are very dark. You know, very slow growth in labor force and productivity, and you have, you know, a much more fragile set of politics almost everywhere, certainly in the United States. And in the end, that's what determines everything.
Let me just ask you one more question, then Patrick, I want to get you jump in on this concept, which is, if you were a Republican in the fall of 2016, you believed, and I'm very generalizing now, that the world was going, and the economy in particular, was going to hell in a handbasket.
And what year did you say? 2000?
Just prior to November. Mm-hmm. And I had a conversation actually with your old colleague, Ben Bernanke, about this that we published in the New York Times just 2 weeks ago. But the view, just how politically, the prism and frame with which people look at the economy today, which was to say that Republicans generally seem to think that the world was going in a very bad direction. Democrats might have thought that it was going in a marginally better direction. And today, Republicans think that the world is off to the races, and Democrats have a more skeptical or circumspect view. What has happened? And how does that relate to what's actually really happening?
I think we'd all feel much better, I think, if we had an answer to that question. I think that, well, I think part of the core of your question is, right, that on so many of the different issues, you know, Russia is kind of the most prominent one, right? It's sort of things that we assumed are sort of actually kind of, you know, ideological beliefs or sort of substantiated beliefs or kind of beliefs based on, you know, fact or evidence or sort of just some way empirically coupled with, you know, the nature of the world, might instead kind of just be, you know, identity based. And so, I mean, well, to your point, if the if politics is actually what matters in understanding the economy today, maybe we gotta.
How much does politics and policy matter to your business? As a startup, to the degree that you're a startup, how much do you think during the day what the tax rate's going to be, whether repatriation can happen, what's going to happen to ACA? Are these issues on the front burner, or are these?
So, look, broadly speaking, I think the fact that sort of so much of the innovation that we've seen over the last 20, 30 years has been concentrated in Silicon Valley and sort of in the technology sector, I think is sort of not, it's not a coincidence that that's been sort of comparatively more likely regulated than sort of the majority of other sectors, in the economy. And so I think it's sort of, it's not the kind of, in general, sort of we spend a whole lot of our time, us in the broad sense, kind of thinking about it, but that doesn't mean it's not very important. In fact, it's the fact that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about it that is itself important, right? Again, this is taking kind of startups in the broad sense. I think that sort of as technology companies start to kind of deploy out from sort of the traditional sort of technology sector where we're just building online services and websites you browse and click on ads and the app versions of that, I think as technology companies deploy out from that to sort of actually addressing kind of the rest of the economy, I think that sort of they tend to butt up against regulatory hurdles sort of far more frequently than they used to. The kind of most striking examples being kind of Uber and Airbnb, which are the two of the most valuable private technology companies, well, both in the US and in the world, and of course have in different ways kind of had their own regulatory challenges and hurdles. And I think the fact that they've had sort of their regulatory challenges and hurdles, that does not mean that sort of just there's some kind of odd coincidence, right? Or that they are kind of that they are doing something kind of structurally untoward. I think it rather suggests that whenever you try to expand outwards from this kind of particular domain that hasn't inherited a whole bunch of legacy regulation, kind of no matter which direction you go in, right? This is like a very good chance you sort of you hit against some again legacy regulatory barrier that impedes your progress. And just kind of on the Stripe version of this, we actually considered in the very beginning starting a bank, in that it was post the financial crisis, and some people thought that the banks had made some mistakes. And just speaking as kind of as consumers of their services, it seemed like some improvement was made possible, and so we thought about starting a just like a consumer bank, just like a bank on your phone or something, right? It's kind of the thing that sort of obviously should exist and like obviously will exist, but didn't at the time and still doesn't. Well, just very, very quickly, and then we decided not to because we sort of concluded that the creation of banks had been largely legislated out of existence, and if you look at just the number of new federal banking charters issued, since the financial crisis, I mean, it essentially has been banned.
You have a, let's just take 30 seconds to do it if we could. You have a fascinating origin story, and to those who are uninitiated, just tell everybody how you started Stripe and what it is.
Sure. So I grew up in Ireland and then came out to the US for college. Grew up in a very rural part of Ireland. Because I started college a little bit early, I kind of skipped the last year of high school. Went to start a startup with my brother, and that startup didn't kind of quite work out. But sort of in the course of starting it, we sort of learned about startups and the challenges that people encounter.
You sold it for several $100 million.
That is not true.
Not true.
Fake news. It is more prevalent than ever these days. But no, it was acquired, but it was not some enormous success. So anyway, but we kind of got to learn a little bit about the kind of community around it, right? And so anyway, as part of that, we sort of realized that there's kind of a set of things that we kind of expected to be hard that actually kind of turned out to be easy. I mean, actually, the fact that it turns out to be possible to start a company at all sort of first blew my mind. Sort of, I sort of thought that sort of companies, technology, edifices, the sort of some kind of celestial beings must kind of start those, and sort of the fact that like a random kid from Ireland could do it, like I was shocked that it was kind of that easy in some sense, at least to start. The success is obviously harder, and then some things you would think would be really would be very straightforward turned out to be like extraordinarily difficult, right? And so among those things was the sort of incredibly basic act, I thought, of just you've built your thing, you've started your service, you've created the whatever, right? The mobile app.
And you like to get paid.
I just want to get paid, right? And like, surely there's just like a website you go to, the getpaidnow.com, and you enter your basic information, and you're up and off and running at the races.
Because you wanted to pay people to pay you for your service.
Yes. As far as we could tell, the businesses that had that did better than the ones that didn't. And so I remember like looking for this service. Like Googling for it, literally, right? And just like not being able to find it. And then kind of I'd go and ask my friends, whatever, and they would say, oh yeah, you have to go to the bank, and you have to get a merchant account, and you have to get a gateway, and you have to go and find an ISO, and like, they would send me links to diagrams and stuff. And so then there was a pivotal dinner in San Francisco in 2009 with my brother John again. We were kind of visiting San Francisco, and we've been kind of talking about this idea and why it was so hard and trying to kind of understand it. I remember kind of walking back afterwards, and he kind of turned and said to me, we should really go build a prototype of this payments thing. It really won't be that hard. And so here we are.
Continue on. I know it's more than 30 seconds, but just what is it exactly?
Fine, okay. It's that service that we couldn't find, right? Or at least it started out as that. It was for people who were starting technology services or businesses of any sort, like people who basically wanted to get paid over the internet and sort of get paid like in a programmatic sense. And I'm kind of distinguishing from kind of peer-to-peer stuff. It's not like your friend paying you for dinner. It's like I'm building a service, a product, an app, and I want on a kind of systematic basis, I want people to be able to pay me. And so that's what Stripe started out as. And then once we launched it, kind of the realization we had, I guess, and kind of the thing that's really shifted as sorry, does that count as a?
No, that keeps going.
Fine. And then what we've realized kind of post-launch, and so the way the business has evolved is that we thought that sort of, nerds like us who were, who thought that the idea of having to go to the bank in person was, unacceptably oppressive. We thought that it was kind of just people like us who kind of had this problem. What we sort of come to realize is that in very broad strokes, and I don't want to kind of generalize too much here, but in very broad strokes, a rapidly increasing fraction of just like all businesses in the world are having to adapt themselves in some way to be technology companies or to sort of take advantage of what the internet makes possible and so on, right? And that the world is becoming sort of far more globalized at like a really accelerating rate, and sort of almost faster than kind of we think or is indicated by the sort of macro statistics, because really what's enabling it is just smartphones. Smartphones are resulting in the deployment of the internet everywhere. And so kind of because of these two forces, rather than have Stripe kind of just being relevant to, again, those early stage technology companies, Stripe is increasingly relevant to all businesses and sort of anyone that wants to be able to kind of better keep up with technology, take advantage of its prospects, expand to more markets, implement new business models, and so forth. And so Stripe is now sort of a technology platform that serves every kind of business and helps more of them get started and help them scale faster.
Okay, so one more question that relates to the economy, and then we'll bring it back to.
I thought you were going to say one more question. What does it actually do?
But, no. It's sort of the question I asked earlier a little bit, but which is how much time do you guys, or how much even just mind share, are you focused on what the growth rate is in the United States, for example, or when the jobs numbers come out and people talk about unemployment in the United States? I mean, my sense of it, and maybe I'm wrong, is that when you go out to the Valley and talk to tech companies, these issues which may dominate the headlines and our own sort of psyches and the policy issues are really not on the brain. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think you're right. Like the macro aggregate statistical versions are not. The micro versions of it and the kind of practical impediments and consequences absolutely 100% are, right? And so, not that long ago, I was meeting with a company that's trying to do sort of cash flow smoothing, right? Because they're, when you sort of look at people sort of at the lower income levels, what you find is that, I mean, of course, just not having a lot of income is kind of itself a problem, but what can be kind of as much of a problem is the variability in it and the unpredictability, right? And kind of if you have commitments, if you have rent, if you have whatever, like, and then you become delinquent, and then you're smacked with overdraft fees, whatever, like this can all be sort of a really big deal, right? And so the product idea, a very good one, I think, is to sort of provide a service that provides smoothing over this for people, right? Good idea. And the enormous challenge for this business is not how do you build the technology behind the app or how do you find customers for it, either on kind of the business side or on the consumer side, like and kind of in both cases they had a lot of enthusiasm, but how do they possibly surmount the sort of state-by-state, federal, somewhere in between kind of multi-agency kind of regulatory impediments? And so I think it's kind of that's the way in which people sort of encounter these macro issues, but it's kind of you're always touching a particular limb of the elephant. Right. You're not sort of looking at the overall elephant itself.
So Tim, take us 30,000 feet up. We spent some time together about a year ago, before the election, and I said to you, what do you think is a realistic growth rate in the United States? This was, by the way, when a certain presidential candidate, who's now has the job, suggested that he thought 4% was not just doable, but realistic. And we're now obviously still living under 2%. And you back then thought 2% was still the number. Your successor now, a former New Yorker who went west named Mr. Mnuchin, has talked about a 3% rate. What do you think is a fair and realistic rate if all of these things that have been talked about come together?
I think it depends on...
And there's a question of whether they all come together.
Growth depends on two things. One is how fast does your labor force grow, which is partly a function of the rate of immigration. It's partly a function of basic demographics. And it's a function of what happens to productivity. Those are the two basic things that determine it. Those things have like these big inertial trajectories, very hard to change quickly, easily. But most people without ideology would look at those two things today and say 2 is realistic. And if you slow immigration dramatically, it'll be meaningfully below that. And if you don't figure out ways to get more returns to innovation spread more broadly, it's not going to go up meaningfully in that context. Another way to answer this question, there's a different way. Can I ask Patrick a question?
Go for it.
Which is, so Patrick, would you be an optimist about what innovation will produce in terms of better economic outcomes? Or do you think, like the skeptics, it's all like vapid and creepy and trivial in comparison to, electricity, things like that? Where are you on that spectrum?
I'm much more on the former side in terms of what's possible.
The optimistic side.
Yeah, for sure, right. And I guess I have many more question marks over sort of what will actually happen, because I think that sort of I'm not sort of a broad technology kind of, I don't subscribe to a broad technology determinism, in the sense I don't think it is inevitable. I don't think we're sort of riding this wave of, and I think there's almost the danger of sort of talking about the growth rate, which, I mean, to your point, is of course in many ways in the short run kind of already determined by the kind of forces you described, is that it sort of feels too inevitable, right? We're kind of riding this cosmic trajectory that we may nudge a little bit kind of in one direction or the other, but sort of broadly speaking is determined. I think that sort of as you look 20, 30 years ahead, I think we could have an enormous amount of innovation if we sort of do the right things, we follow the right policies and so forth, or we could have a quarter of that amount. And kind of as to whether we're going to have a quarter or sort of the full amount, I'm not sure that I'm pessimistic, but I many more questions.
Can I ask a separate question? Because it's a political question, but really so much of what has dominated the politics of the moment is an employment story in the United States, or at least it's been described as an employment story in the United States. I would suggest that we are close to full employment in the United States, and I know people debate that and tell me that I'm crazy. But I also wonder, I'm somewhat also a fatalist in that I also worry about some of the stuff that you guys are building out in Silicon Valley, and I have a view that maybe manufacturing in America is sort of an anachronistic idea. So when you put all of that together, where do you land on that? I'll go to Tim first then.
I don't know, but I don't think you like this, Patrick. I don't really think that the main problem facing the country is the absence of incentives or evidence of innovation. Recognizing, accepting the fact that there are like lots of constraints and badly designed regulation and a lot of power of incumbents, a lot of capture, I stipulate all that. I feel like, yeah, and it would be better if there was better incentives and some of those constraints were removed. I think that's good. I think fundamentally it would be good over the long term. I don't think that's our problem. I think our problem is that we have frankly, a big misallocation of talent into those cool things and have deeply neglected the investment in getting better outcomes out of policymakers on things that affect incentives and public goods, things the market can't do. And so,
not enough. So you're saying not enough smart people are going in.
yeah, I think,
implementing or choosing
I mean,
policy.
we as a country, we basically think that people look with government with deep ambivalence at best. And, you're seeing I think the consequences of a progressive erosion of people's sense of value in trying to not just elect people who are better, but have people go work for the country who know something about the complicated challenges facing the country. And I feel like if you don't fix that, then you're not going to come close to getting more promise spread more broadly across the economy of all the innovation you're seeing. But you'd expect me to say that. That's my bias.
Well, to your point about sort of the economy being at full employment or kind of approaching it and so forth, I mean, I do think there is kind of a real problem there in the sense that the disemployment rate, particularly of certain demographics, a lot of the kind of auteur, work and manufacturing jobs and so on, kind of being among it, like that, I think is real, right? And so if you kind of cut it the right way, and of course it's not just a question of are you in a job or not? It's like what kind of job and what's happening to your income, and the fact that sort of for again certain demographics, it's been sort of median income has been stagnant since the late 60s. I think that is a problem, right? And so I think it really depends on sort of which lens you bring to it. To your point about sort of the problem not being kind of insufficient incentives, I mean, I think that's true. There are lots of incentives for innovation, kind of as there have always been. I think it's the presence of impediments, and not just impediments in terms of some purported regulatory oppressor, but even just like more basic kind of structural issues like. Immigration, which you mentioned, is kind of an obvious one, but even sort of the domestic version of immigration around kind of urban planning and housing policy, where kind of one cannot move today in so many cases to the kind of high productivity regions of the country, which is it's a barrier to innovation. It's not a lack of an incentive.
What would it take for me?
I agree with that.
What would it take for me to incentivize you to move your headquarters to a Rust Belt state?
You'd have to make our employees want to move to a Rust Belt state. Like we didn't choose San Francisco because sort of John and I, love San Francisco. I mean, it's a nice city, right? But we went to San Francisco because you rob banks because that's where the money is, and we went to San Francisco because that's where the people who are interested in innovation and are sort of skilled at engineering and have done this before in various ways, where they are. And I think, like, broadly speaking, what you see, I mean, across the world is the returns to kind of agglomeration in cities are increasing. Kind of a side effect of sort of knowledge work becoming a larger fraction of the economy is be able to get together to sort of do it together and have the ideas bounce around and all the rest. That's becoming more important. And there's the Moretti work showing that, like, in his view, based on that model, that you just sort of enabling easier sort of or more efficient allocation of labor to the right city, like that alone would give you a 10% boost in US GDP, and of course that compounds over time, right? And so, again, for the question of what would it take to get us to move, I think you'd have to solve the issue for the employees and why they would want to move, and there I think you have to kind of go against the laws of like knowledge physics, where just there are increasing returns to scale.
So then what do we do about some of these places that have been effectively left behind, if you will, where the president says he's going to bring back coal jobs? I'm skeptical of that, and I'm trying to figure out what kind of jobs they can get.
Well, I like to think. I mean, there are pockets of innovation. Talented people came together, dispersed in like lots of parts of the country. There's little ecosystems of innovation outside the valley, in places you may not have expected. Why did they grow up there? Usually you had a combination of university, and then you had the sort of cumulative effect built on itself about the appeal of the community network, and then that reinforces itself. But usually there were a set of, the university's example about, but there's a set of public investments in some basic things like that. So I think you have to be willing to spend resources. I really think you do. You have to spend resources to create some of the infrastructure that can attract that. There's not great examples of doing that with the wise hand of the state, because the lots of stuff gets in the way of how the government allocates those resources, and we're not very good at it. So sometimes they grow up in spite of that, sometimes they're catalyzed by that, but that has to be a part of the solution.
I'm not actually sort of as pessimistic about it being possible as maybe the kind of basic returns to scale argument makes it sound. I mean, there are, to your point, there are sort of cases where it has happened, right? And so it's like clearly possible in some sense. I do think there's like just a sort of, you have to consider the dynamic version of this, where I think like the sort of zeroth level thing is, well, for the people in those areas, like make sure they actually want to be in those areas. For at least some of them, they would rather be in a higher productivity area, but again, we've kind of banned them through land prices or immigration laws, right? But of course, that's people have different preferences, and there are different parts of the world, and different parts of the world are better suited to certain things, right? I think the sort of the knowledge foundation in the form of sort of the anchor university, and perhaps some specialization in sort of some particular domain, stuff like CMU and the sort of robotic specialization around that, and sort of some pretty enlightened policy. I think that can work. I think it's unglamorous. I think it's difficult. I think it sort of requires a bunch of factors kind of going in your favor and working together. But if the stars align, I think that can work.
But these aren't a solution to the problem you raised, which is what happens to the manufacturing worker. What happens to the worker whose like sense of dignity and value and worth was like creating something with their hands in that tactical way? Because most of things we need and consume in the world today, they take less investment, and they require less people, and they require different skill set. We've been through these kind of things in the past with big waves of innovation. It's like deeply disruptive, long arcs of pretty drastic, savage disruption, dislocation, and you need to have a safety net and a set of protections around that to help transition. And thus I think the need for much greater need today. I think there's been in the past for better design of the provision of the public good, and that's why I keep coming back to I think what's essentially a political challenge. I don't think that. We've had this debate before, which is you can ask yourself today, which is there a problem we don't know what to do? Is there a problem in the absence of the knowledge of what would produce better outcomes? Or is the problem that we're so far from the frontier of actually applying what we know works? And I think in our country today, our problem is more the latter, which is there are whole things we could do to improve outcomes. We're so far short of that frontier because our political is so dysfunctional. Just focusing on closing that gap would be great.
Okay, so I'm making you dictator for the day. So dictator Geithner can do it. You say we know what to do.
I think we know things
what
that
are
would
those
be better.
things that if you could be king for the day, what would you do?
I don't think they have a huge amount of like great excitement and drama in them. They're fundamental things. They're like better schools, they're better infrastructure, they're better design safety net. There are better incentives for innovation, investment, and there are lower barriers to entry in a bunch of professions and industries. And one reason I think you can be optimistic about what's possible is because, again, even in a world where a lot of the things we're facing today are common across the major developing countries, there are many countries in the world that are much better at those things than we are. So adapting some of those would help. Now we'll still be left with a set of other challenges too. But I'd focus on those two.
Why did you start your company here? Meaning,
here in the U.S. or here in Silicon Valley, or
yeah, I mean, you could have started in Ireland. I don't know, maybe you have a subsidiary there. You don't have like the Irish-Dutch sandwich or whatever the tax scheme is that everybody uses to.
We for a long time actually, Wikipedia said that Stripe was an Irish company. I guess because we were Irish, but then fortunately we were able to a couple of years ago go and open a Dublin office. But we were in San Francisco because again that's where the people are. Again, people impute too much agency to sort of the companies themselves, as if kind of we could create whatever value has been created sort of anywhere, right. And it's kind of what's causing us or them to sort of go and do it in the particular areas in which they are. But it's we're much more subject to where the knowledge capital is.
How much of this immigration issue is meaningful to your company?
That's really meaningful. that has been, it's hard to say, but I think it's possible that that's been the kind of, it's always hard to kind of delineate exactly, but I think it's possible that has been the kind of single biggest impediment to our growth and success.
Really?
Yes.
Right now?
Yep. I mean, like,
they're doing kind of well, by the way.
Ability is pretty evenly distributed around the world, as best we can tell, right? And so we've sort of, population of the world, a couple billion people, right? And sort of 300 million of those people have been tagged with the kind of hireable bit.
Right.
And so kind of the vast majority of people sort of have been removed from consideration at the beginning of the game, and sort of, it's like you're choosing the team in school or something, and straight away.
I guess the larger question is, do we not have enough really smart, talented, thoughtful engineers in the United States already?
I think the notion of enough is such a fallacy. I mean, there's no fixed amount of sort of innovation where you sort of allocate the innovation tickets to sort of the most worthy recipients. There could be 10 times as much as there is today, and the limiting reagent is the number of talented people. And we have chosen to really constrict the funnel like very aggressively.
Has this impacted any of your businesses, Tim? I mean, within the Warburg context?
I think we all have a common. I think we have a common, and we a huge part of our business are investments in countries outside the United States. But absolutely, we see the same thing for those here. I mean, there are ways you can adapt, which I'm sure you do, ways to access those other pools of talent outside the United States without being able to employ them in the United States. But the deeper question for us as a country, is that better for us than having them come here and work here and start a business?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a. It's so crazy to me that sort of this is sort of a politically contentious matter, right? Given that, and to be clear, I mean sort of the kinds of people that Stripe or the technology company would hire, right? In that the U.S. has such a sort of an insane privilege, right? Where it is kind of the destination of choice, not in every case, but in certainly a plurality and maybe in a majority of cases, the destination of choice of the highest potential, most ambitious, smartest, up-and-comer, whatever, people all around the world. And that's sort of such an unbelievable tailwind for the country, right? That, one would think that it would be quite aligned with the sort of general worldview of our current president, that, what could be what could be better for the U.S. than sort of vacuuming up the talented people in other countries all around the world and having them come and make their fortunes, innovate, do good here within the borders of the United States.
You've been very outspoken about the immigration issue and some of the political issues. I'm curious, this is a question that I think CEOs are grappling with, small businesses, big businesses, whatnot, which is the message that you send on behalf or to your employees, which might be one that might be critical, for example, of the president, but then recognizing that you have customers, and that those customers may have very different political views than your employees. And how you grapple with that. We've now watched big consumer companies, PepsiCo has dealt with this, Google has dealt with this, Microsoft has dealt with this, or I don't want to say dealt with it, they've had to confront this issue one way or the other, and frankly, they have probably been hurt to some degree one way or the other with customers along the way. Do you guys think about these issues?
Probably not your customers. Your customers are probably completely aligned.
Half of our customers are in the South and the Midwest, which makes them more likely, per the demographics, to be Trump supporters. And so it's not as I think bifurcated as perhaps it appears.
Has that impacted your business at all? Have people come out, customers, and said, "I don't want to do business with you guys. You guys are"?
I think there's a thing that, I mean, the direct answer to your question is no. No one has specifically come and said that to us, right? And maybe somebody feels that way or someone kind of silently self-selected out, but no one has come to specifically deliver that message. And more broadly, Stripe works with both political parties. We work with both presidential campaigns. And I think there is a thing that's valuable and worth preserving in the US where, generally speaking, people really try to sort of prioritize the the longer term institutions and the sort of longer run norms over the shorter term exigencies and disputes and kind of internecine strife, right? I think that's a good thing. I think we sort of the application of purity tests and ideological restrictions and so on, I think that's a dangerous direction. But at the same time, we're also confronted with something relatively unprecedented here, and it seems a little bit unbecoming to merely bite your tongue. And so kind of the path that Stripe has chosen is we're going to be pretty forthright on what we as individuals believe, and I count myself sort of among those. But we're also, from an institutional and a structural standpoint, sort of Stripe the company, we're willing to work with a very broad set of causes and businesses and nonprofits and entities of every sort. And I think that's really an important thing.
Just one observation, slightly tangential, but I think it's true, which is that
how do you choose how public to be?
I'm in a slightly more complicated place, but let me answer a slightly different way. I think that the dominant attention by corporate America to Washington has been focused overwhelmingly in terms of resources and attention on, not to be unfair, on the defense and offense around the small parochial issue of your tax preference or your regulatory moat. And overwhelmingly, what consumes resources they spend on these kind of things is that understandable imperative around the parochial defense and offense around those sorts of things. And I think, like on an issue like this, I think that as an economy, as in a system, this economy and its business sector will suffer from a further progressive erosion around a sense of competence and commitment to broad long-term norms and these kind of things. And that to withstand that, you need a more collective, more forceful collective investment of resources in defense of those things. That would be a good, noble, valuable thing to do. So I think in some sense, the line, which is you don't know how valuable things are until they're at risk.
Let me ask
and it's worth people feeling some of the stuff that we took for granted is fundamentally at risk, and hopefully that might motivate some better designed, longer term investment by the great innovators, great companies of the country in, again, a bit of repair, institutional repair to the basic functions of government policy.
Let me ask you about risk, which is to say that right now, I think you, Patrick, you mentioned the VIX, which is effectively measures how much volatility there is in the stock market, how much certainty or uncertainty there is out there. And right now it is at a remarkable all-time low. When you were in your office in Washington,
it was higher.
It was higher. And frankly, I would interview CEOs for the New York Times or CNBC or whatever it was, and they would tell you that they were paralyzed by uncertainty. They couldn't see straight. They didn't know what to do. Their whole business was, everything was uncertain. They couldn't make decisions. They couldn't make capital investments because who knew where the world was about to go? That's what you'd hear repeatedly. Today, for reasons that that still vex me, people seem to think things are remarkably certain. Does that make sense to you?
I don't really have that view. I mean, we all talk to different people in this world, but I think there's a sense of hope, whatever you think the foundation of that is, that corporate America is on the verge of a more accommodating, friendly set of tax and regulatory incentives. And that the hope is that we're on the verge of that, and that's going to be transforming in terms of how fast the economy grows. And that the things they fear, which are about uncertainty or about trade wars or protection or incompetence, are lower probability. Right. I don't actually think that, I think fundamentally if you look at what's happening now is people are more like, now they're a little more tentative, less optimistic about what's going to come, still somewhat tentative and fearful about it, and I don't think you're seeing at the moment people acting with a sense of great confidence. about the long-term, massive improvement in the near-term growth prospects of the economy. I think that people are being actually kind of more tentative, rationally more tentative.
Go ahead.
I'll just quickly add to that, and I agree with Tim, which is good, I guess, since he knows infinitely more than I will ever know on the topic. But just, I think the focus on VIX is actually maybe a little bit misplaced in the sense that it's short term, right? And if you look at the price of 3-year and 5-year puts, those have gone up a lot, and so evidently people have a relatively rosy-eyed view of the next couple of months. But again, to Tim's point, you sort of look beyond the time horizon of what we can immediately see. I think the uncertainty and the sort of the broader structural tremors become more apparent.
Tim, and I don't mean to relitigate the history of what took place in Washington under the past administration. But,
sounds like you'd like to.
But I'd like to. Yeah. How much does the disposition of a president or an administration towards business, positively or negatively, forgetting about the possibility of what legislation may come or not, just the disposition, the sense of, I want you to I want you to succeed. I want your company to succeed. I want you to employ more people. I want it to be great for you. I want you to make money. I want all of that, which is, I think, representative, dare I say, of what at least the Trump administration has suggested. And how important is that relative to, and maybe this is just a function of the financial crisis and what came after, an administration that I think I could argue, having known a lot of the people in it, was much more about how do you make it a safer system? You used to talk about that. How do we prevent the next crisis? How do we prevent bubbles? It was a different disposition, if you will. So how do you think about those two things?
There are these deep beliefs in the American political system about parties and presidents and economic outcomes, which are deeply confused. One of the dominant beliefs is that Republican administrations are good for economic growth and good for asset prices, investing returns, and fiscally responsible and prudent, and good for profits. The reality is sort of the inverse of that. Most of those things do better under Democratic administrations than Republicans, but still that belief, that hope persists in some sense, which is strange in this thing. It is true that what Keynes called animal spirits, which is a sense of confidence, a sense of optimism, have big effects on behavior, and can have big effects on behavior. And that's a very ephemeral, difficult thing to figure out. How do you construct it and how do you build that? And it's partly about some sense of stability in the outcomes, and it's probably some sense that stuff gets better. And fostering that building is very valuable. But that's a much more complicated, fragile, nuanced thing than a subtle thing than, will tax rates be lower, I think. Right. I think, a bunch of great capitalists in the United States who say that, my marginal tax rate has no effect on where I invest, how much I invest, how much I put into those kind of things. Some people
Yeah, no, and you've asked this question a couple of ways, of sort of to what degree is there a fixation or focus in Silicon Valley on things like put away the macroeconomic statistics, even things like the tax rate, right? And I think that sort of, to your point, we are way too focused on those things and not nearly enough on sort of the broader structural issues around sort of, as you look across the economy overall, sort of the pattern you see again and again is sort of, restriction on supply and sort of subsidy of demand, be it in education or housing or healthcare and what have you, right? But I think sort of what you suspect there, where either there's kind of too much focus politically and actually in practice kind of much less focus in the business community, is in my experience, certainly in technology, very much correct.
Okay, so I want to incorporate some of the questions that you guys have been asking, which I've been just provided on this card. This is a favorite perennial question that I like to ask, so thank you for it. I don't know who sent it up. Tim has answered this before, but maybe you have a new answer. And I know you probably have a very interesting answer, not that your answer is not going to be fascinating, which is a very basic, straight-up question. Should the banks be broken up? And let me just also throw a wrinkle into this, which is to suggest that, very interestingly, over the past month, both Gary Cohn, who's the senior economic advisor to the president, has talked about bringing Glass-Steagall back, as has Elizabeth Warren on the other end of things for a very long time, which make sort of odd bedfellows in all of this.
There's that thing when the left and the right agree, you can't really tell. What does that mean? They're right, or does it mean can't tell? But why don't you ask Patrick first, because you can know what I think. I'll repeat what I think, but
I was going to say I want to go second because I couldn't dare to contradict him, but I think it should be possible to compete with banks, and I think that might result in more fragmentation. And again, this sound like I feel the need to caveat sort of so much of what I say with I'm not a Silicon Valley libertarian. I don't self-identify as a libertarian really in any way. I believe in regulations, institutions, rule of law.
Which reminds me, by the way, Peter Thiel is one of your investors.
Okay.
Before you answer the bank question, tell us about those conversations.
Peter and I have had some very direct and frank conversations. Isn't that what they say in the diplomatic meetings? Exactly. Yeah. Right. There was a frank but cordial exchange of views. But no, we've been very direct with Peter throughout as to, on a lot of things we agree, right? Certainly which startups one should invest in, but also. I think he's been correct in his diagnosis of sort of a whole bunch of different issues, including the sort of kind of insidious ways in which certain kinds of innovation, have been stymied. And then when he comes to choose between presidential candidates,
Is that hurting him, you think, in the Valley, by the way?
Hurting in what sense?
His ability to invest in new companies, in terms of the relationships he has with people. I don't.
Look, the honest answer is I don't know. I do know that the vast majority of the Valley disagrees with him.
Right.
And is there kind of some weird thing that takes place where sort of people are then more curious about him, or he's more prominent, and so they're more likely to go? I don't know, right? What's the net effect?
Right.
I think it'd be much better. You get much better information if you asked another investor that, because they're spending all their time talking to founders and competing to invest in companies.
Has he called you to bring you to the White House?
No.
Not yet. Okay. We digress on that. Let's go back to the banks.
You want to?
You didn't tell me whether you're ready to break up the banks.
You should be able to compete with them. Sorry, before we were kind of pulled aside in that caveat, I was going to say, generally speaking, I'm not a libertarian. However, we really have essentially legislated the formation of new banks out of existence. And just kind of empirically, there are none. And so I'm for fragmentation in the banking system that arises from sort of correcting that.
Can I make one observation about this basic challenge? In some ways, we had a financial crisis in part because we allowed a vast array of different types of financial institutions to evolve outside the constraints that are imposed on banks, who are allowed to compete with banks, against banks in a whole bunch of things, without being subject to those constraints and without access to the kind of protections in the safety net that are essential to make banks stable. So a big reason why our financial crisis was so terrible, apart from all the fraud and abuse and bad, stupid stuff that happened, was because we actually allowed a huge amount of competition with banks without any of the protections necessary to make the system more stable. Should you break up the banks? The deep existential thing is to try to make the system as itself more stable against the risk of panics and Great Depressions. And there's some risk that if you have a system too concentrated, banks too big, that you make that challenge more difficult because the costs of failure of an individual bank are much greater. But if you have a system of small banks spread across the country, which is, you could say was like the United States in the Great Depression, you can have a system that's much more fragile too. The idea that making them all smaller makes the system more stable is not true. Paul Krugman likes to remind people that the Great Depression was a panic in a system that was a much more atomized system of smaller banks, much less concentrated. Also, our system today, which again has lots of things to worry about, most of the major economies, Canada, Germany, Japan, systems that actually were more stable in this crisis, had much larger institutions as a share of their economy that were mostly universal banks, able to operate across the Glass-Steagall lines. And their systems were easier to stabilize and protect, in part because they did not allow a lot of competition with banks. So yeah, we should worry about trying to keep the system more stable and more fair, But it's a tougher challenge than trying to think about, what if you could want to make them smaller or narrower in their
Can you
scope.
explain the different motivations between Gary Cohen's effort to even socialize the idea of Glass-Steagall and Elizabeth Warren's? Do you feel like you understand?
Andrew, you know more about this than anybody, and you can do a better job of like assigning motive. There's some interesting motives, but you know what they are.
You could articulate that for us.
It's okay. You could do it. I don't know really what Gary really thinks about this. Another way to think about this is that if you were sitting there and you could sit there and decide, okay, what are the highest priorities you could think about for the country on the economic front? I don't think you'd put the evolution of this debate very high on your list before you a bunch of things you want to run through first before you decide yourself, okay, are we at the optimal frontier of the design of the constraints in the financial system? By the way, I didn't mean to say I agree with you should have competition with banks. I think it's a good thing. I agree with that. And I'm not saying we have too much of it. I'm just saying if you think about, if you create a system where the arbitrage opportunities are massive and you let a huge diverse set of institutions build up outside the constraints of those protections, you can create a more fragile, more stable system.
I think what you allow people to do with deposits, I think a lot of what you say carries weight.
All right, separate question. News you can use for this audience. This question goes to you. How secure is it to pay online, and how can we protect ourselves? And I will caveat this by saying that I happened to have my credit card stolen last week. It was a Chase card, and somebody went to Brooklyn and spent $10,000 in the course of about an hour and a half.
Which you didn't have to pay for.
Which I didn't, and actually the Chase people were very nice. I called them up, and I felt very bad for them, but it was a... No, but really, what do we do about this?
Generally speaking today, online security and kind of to your point, it works really well, right? There was kind of a Wild West frontier back in sort of the mid-90s when all of this was kind of first coming about, and we sort of stressed out about how are we going to encrypt things and can you even send a credit card number over the internet and so on. And broadly speaking, we found solutions that work really well to that, right? And that it's somewhere in the teens, depends on exactly how you measure it, but a sizable fraction of just all US consumer spending is now spent on the internet.
Right.
So that's such a vast, enormous number of transactions, and the fact that sort of this kind of fraud is comparatively rare would seem to suggest that the system is actually working, broadly speaking, very well. And even when it breaks, as you sort of found out with your experience, it's generally not that bad, and that the structure is set up such that it's the bank that's on the hook, right? And banks are, there's a lot of good to be said for them. I feel like they're having a hard time tonight, but generally speaking, they're on the hook. The thing that really is still sort of an architectural mistake in how transactions on the internet work is that you have to give your credit card number to the entity that you're transacting with, right? To the website, to the app, and whatever it is. And that's kind of the same credit card number everywhere. And so if it's breached once, then it's kind of breached everywhere. And that's at least a huge hassle, right? And maybe worse because it again has kind of worse security properties. And so I think what you'll see over the next kind of 5 or 10 years is ways to fix that so that you're not kind of using the same sort of plain text credential everywhere across all these different apps and services. But broadly speaking, just as a descriptive matter today, yeah, the system works quite well.
When are we going to really get rid of our credit cards and do this Apple Pay thing or one of these kind of things for real? I feel like none of these things have really taken off the way they were supposed to.
Big parts of the world, you'd never use a card. You might not touch cash, and you'd use your phone. So we're behind the big parts of the world in many ways, in part because our system works well enough for people to create some disadvantages to changing behavior.
Tim through Warburg is an investor in a company called Gojek in Indonesia, which we were just discussing, and they sort of operate these these kind of mobile ATMs essentially. I mean, they're basically people on motorbikes, right? But they're kind of mobile ATMs, and so kind of there's sort of increasing usage of Gojek as a form of payment. To your point, sort of finally getting to something kind of a more advanced substrate than the credit card. But why is that happening in Indonesia? Why is that not happening here? I mean, you tried to implement a people on motorbike as an ATM, here in the US, there would soon be sort of many different individuals from various different government departments who'd be sort of very interested in your practices. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's even wrong, in that there are all kinds of bad things that do happen elsewhere that don't happen here, and I think there's a lot of truth to what Tim says, where there's real downsides on both sides. But I think,
this is a policy issue for you in some ways.
I think it's in large part a policy. I definitely do not claim that it is solely a policy issue, or sort of if policy evaporate in the morning that we're all going to go switch to Apple Pay. But I do think these sort of the divergent outcomes that you see in different parts of the world are in part a consequence of different policy regimes.
Yeah, I mean, to see you're being very charitable on how to say it, but in countries that didn't have this massive investment in a bank infrastructure for accessing the payment system, and very few people had credit cards or bank accounts, but people had a cell phone, you could leap around all the constraints and inertia in that kind of context and go much quicker to a form of accessing the payment system and transacting. It is a less costly, more efficient, cheaper, better experience in some sense. And there's great advantages in that context, and it's a good test of some of the things you talk about, which I think you're really eloquent about, which is to think about the costs of the muck of protections that regulations reinforce around incumbents. And it's good to weaken those, and it's good to test those and allow competition against those.
Talking about policy, this is fun. Long, short, Uber. You're an investor now, Tim.
They don't use your application yet, right?
They do not yet use our application.
Okay, just to show bias. I mean, just to reveal bias.
No, look. I'm going to let you answer first.
But no, but it's interesting because it talk about policy and technology and who's moving forward.
There's a whole bunch of recent news about Uber that I guess that question is not about. Just as a descriptive matter, like do I think that Uber stock will gain value? Yes.
As a cultural phenomenon, I mean, given all the headlines?
Which of us is that one directed at?
You're both trying to avoid it. So let me ask you, this is a selfish question, long, short Snapchat, by the way. What do you think of Snap these days?
You have the wrong brother here for that one. Partially I'm too old, and so I don't use it and just don't understand it. Partially because look, I wish I was joking. And partially he expounded to me one evening. I'll come home in the evening, and he'll tell me about the S1 that he'd been reading in bed that night or something, and. Not only did John and I start the company together, we also live together, and he gave me a very eloquent assessment of the S1 and his take on the future prospects of business and so forth. It was pretty late that evening, and I can't remember what he said. But
what about Tim? Tim, I know you're on Snap. I get you. He vomits, rainbows on all the.
I'm conflicted. I have a good friend who runs one of the major competitors, so I don't really feel like it's appropriate for me to.
Okay.
Also, I don't really know anything about the question.
Fair enough. Okay. Here's a good one. Here's a good one. Why isn't the richest country in the world able to offer universal health care?
Well, you know the answer to that. It's not because we can't afford it. It's because we have a large part of the political system who doesn't believe in it.
Okay. This one I know.
It's not more complicated than that.
Tim's going to want to. I know Tim's going to want to grab this one and answer it immediately. Is Trump going to bankrupt America? And there is a large question about whether some of these policies that are described as pro-growth, whether the cost-benefit analysis, and what that means to the deficit and the debt in this country.
I do think that there's a set of things that you could justify borrowing to spend money on that would have had high economic returns, even though we have a relatively high debt burden as a share of the economy. And but it is important to recognize that there are some fundamental constraints on how much you could do, and they relate to what you use that borrowing room for. And I think if there was a famous Republican who said deficits don't matter. many other Republicans have said these things pay for themselves. Neither of those two things are true. And there are a set of basic constraints on how much you can afford to give away in a temporary or permanent tax cut that you're not prepared to pay for. And we're going to have a good test of whether that's the traditional constraints that have applied to that in our political system hold in this context, whether they get relaxed. I tend to think that you're going to see a willingness to go borrow a lot of money to spend on some set of tax cuts now, like we saw in the previous Republican administration. I think that even though there's a lot of Republicans who think that's probably not that wise, and they should be governed by some broader set of discipline on fiscal stuff, usually they've waived that constraint if it got in the way of legislating a tax cut. That's the revealed preference of what's now the governing party.
You have a thought?
Well, slightly to that question, and somewhat also the previous one about kind of universal health care, and that I'm strongly in favor of it, but it seems to me that the thing that sort of doesn't get nearly enough attention is we're already spending a lot on healthcare, right? We spend upwards of 18 points of GDP on healthcare, and and we're kind of clearly not spending sufficient in some sense in that it's not universal, right? But on the other hand, Singapore spends 4.9%. And ranks way above us in the WHO quality of healthcare rankings, and so I think we I think there's kind of an obvious demand side of that equation of like, are we willing to spend whatever is required to achieve universal healthcare? But there's also kind of a supply question of like, what's going wrong there, right? And I feel like we somehow I think that side of the question doesn't get enough attention. In fact, I'd love to know how many people are even aware of the fact that sort of there exists a country that spends, again on a per GDP basis, a third of what we do.
With better average outcome.
No, exactly. They're ranked substantially. I don't recall exactly. Singapore is 9th or something like that in the WHO rankings. US is 30 something. Anyway. One can have sort of different beliefs as to kind of what the underlying cause there is, right? But I think it's another instance, and again, just does not get enough attention in terms of restrictions in different forms on the nature of the supply, and then kind of ever increasing subsidy in the demand.
Okay, two more. One I don't think you'll answer, but I'm going to try. Comey, discuss.
I live in the West Coast.
I don't know, Andrew. I feel like I'm troubled by most of the things people are troubled by, but I don't feel like I have any cool, blinding insight beyond the obvious on it. I'm not, it seems to me kind of a scary, dark thing.
Which part?
All of it. But it seems kind of obvious.
Elaborate.
I'm not going to elaborate, really. Yeah. Remember, I was just like a civil servant in the Treasury and the Fed.
I don't even know where to go with this. Let me ask you a final question.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Okay, no, you go first.
No, you go first.
Well, I was just going to ask Tim what he thinks we most disagree on.
I don't know. I don't know. We haven't spent that much time together. I don't know. I think we look at a set of challenges from kind of different backgrounds and perspectives. But I don't know that I disagree with you on a lot of your things you've said and approach. I think you're smart and thoughtful about it. I do. But we need to spend more time together, then we'll figure out some stuff.
Well, let's come back to the V2 or it's crossfire style.
Yeah. Final question.
I mean, my general tendency is, people would say, they'd look at the Washington when I was there and they'd say, gee, it seems like a mess. And I would say it's much worse than you think. So is that a disagreement? No, it's not really a disagreement.
If you could start a new company today, where would you do it?
Which country?
Yeah, well, actually, I'll make it interesting. If the country's the U.S., I'm going to ask you to tell me where in the U.S. you'd start it, but maybe your answer is going to be to do it in another country.
I don't have credibility in this. Patrick does.
You invest in these companies now.
I'm like
You're supposed to be a capitalist.
I'm like early in my apprenticeship in capitalism.
So what were you before you were a capitalist?
I was, just a technocrat, guardian of the public interest. I hoped.
Look, I mean, the obvious answer is San Francisco or kind of Silicon Valley more broadly. Maybe the sort of version of the question that's kind of more interesting is like, what would stop me or kind of one from doing so when it sort of would seem to be the obvious choice? Silicon Valley is becoming immensely expensive, but I've harped on about sort of our collective effort through land use regulation to sort of asphyxiate our most productive regions. So instead, maybe Silicon Valley, I think, is becoming more entitled and complacent. And I think when you sort of look at the ethos and culture of sort of what gave rise to Silicon Valley, right, and you read about sort of the mindset and the backgrounds of the people involved and so on, and kind of what they came from and just kind of the nature of the place. There wasn't much technology around it, so those people were outsiders. They certainly kind of it certainly was not kind of a high status pursuit, and it certainly didn't sort of attract people who themselves had any attraction to status. And then you kind of fast forward to today. I mean, I think that I'm extremely optimistic about the sort of, broadly speaking, the sort of collective fruits of the endeavor. But in terms of the actual culture in the place, I think it's at a complicated, potentially inflection point. And if somebody told me they weren't going to start a company in Silicon Valley for this reason, I wouldn't dismiss it as out of hand. I wouldn't think that they're crazy.
So what's your second choice, if not the Valley?
Seattle.
I mean, look, I think there's a kind of diversity that LA does better at than San Francisco or than the Bay Area. There are many more different kinds of pursuits. There are more industries. It sprawls more. There's more heterogeneity. But I guess I should take advice when offered. New York, obviously.
New York. Patrick Collison, Tim Geithner, former Secretary of the Treasury. It has been a privilege to have this conversation with you. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for the conversation.